what if I told you there were several ways to blend watercolor pencils without the streaky look? I'm going to show you 3 hacks that you can use now to get a smooth watercolor effect and paint absolutely anything that you want with watercolor pencils. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. The first hack is to use a palette with your watercolor pencils, a plastic palette or a paper palette, just like these two. This one here is the Caran d'Ache mixing palette. It has 2 sides, one smooth and one rough. And with the rough side, you can easily create a swatch of color with watercolor pencils, as you can see. And it was actually my subscribers who told me about this tool, and I truly cannot live without it. Now I have it. In the same way, you can use a scrap piece of watercolor paper and you will get pretty much the same effect. All you need to do is to activate the paint like this with a little bit of water, and then you're ready to paint some smooth washes that are just like watercolor. The only difference between the two methods, despite the waste of paper with a paper palette hack, is going to be that the wet pigment sinks inside the paper fibers a little, which means less paint, while on the plastic palette, it stays on the surface, so you always get the most out of your scribbles. And I always link my supplies to all my videos, so if you want to check out that palette, you can find it in the description. I enjoy this hack to paint backgrounds, and this painting is a great example because here I wanted to render the blurry looks of the forest in the background, and it would have been extremely tedious and hard to achieve by just coloring with the pencils. So you can see I scribbled with all the colors I wanted to add right on the Caran d'Ache palette, and I dropped the activated paint on paper after wetting the whole sheet. The pros of this hack are that this is really fast and easy to do, and as you can see, you don't have to buy the palette to try and use it. You can use paper. You can also use this hack to paint smoothly on large or small areas as you wish, and that all comes down to the paintbrush size you use, and it's a great method for skies paintings too. Also, look at how easily the colors blend together. It's just like watercolor painting. The pigment from pencils can feel a tad chalky at times. I mean, they're not as watery as watercolors in a way. It just feels a little bit different, and you could tell when you know both mediums. But in terms of looks and results and the way colors mix and blend together, you really get the same effect. It's also very easy to layer several times. Here I added more colors and I re-wetted the whole sheet at least 3 times, and it's completely doable and easy to do. I've shown this in other videos here on YouTube, and I also teach this painting on my Patreon in real time as well as others. So if you want to learn the skill and how to use watercolor pencils and watercolor, you will find a link in the description of my video. Now this hack has a few cons, nothing bad, but I thought you might like to know that if you want to paint a lot with watercolor pencils and use this method, then I really think the palette by Caran d'Ache will be a useful investment. It's way more convenient than paper and it will last you forever. And for me, it's the best tool I've bought so far in 2023, but that's only because I'm big on watercolor pencils. The second hack that I'd like to share is the coloring hack. And if you're thinking that there's nothing new about coloring with watercolor pencils, then think again, because I noticed a lot of people have the technique wrong, and that can ruin the way the paints blend together, because there is a way to blend watercolor pencils after coloring. It does start with the coloring itself. And the most important factor to make or break the coloring, and that I think you should know about, is the quality of your watercolor pencils. A lot of cheap brands are hard to color with, and they leave streaks beneath the blending. Probably why watercolor pencils are so underrated too. But then there are brands that are excellent, like Faber-Castell and their Arbor Dürer pencils, and also the Caran d'Ache Museum pencils. The Inktense water-soluble pencils are also pretty good, even if they're ink-based. But what I mean to say is that with a good quality, I noticed that I could work with a blunt or a sharp lead the same, and I could apply medium pressure while coloring without being super careful at all. I generally go with large circular motions, and it's enough. It's easy to do. With a poor watercolor pencil's quality, however, the best approach is going to be to work with a sharper lead, then press little while coloring, and go in smaller and more careful circular motions, so you can see it's a little bit harder to work with those. And you really want to focus on preserving the paper, because if you press too hard with cheap watercolor pencils, they're usually so dry to begin with that you'll indent the paper for little pigment and vibrancy anyways. And by the way, with these cheap kinds, I totally recommend to only use my first hack for a base layer for a smoother effect, and later why not color on top. In my painting, I was using my Faber-Castell Arbustor watercolor pencils, one of the best types there is, and you might be able to tell I'm not necessarily careful like I would be with graphite or a colored pencil, because I know the pigment will dissolve well with water and streaks will be minimal. The pros of the coloring hack is that you can see where your painting is going from just coloring, and I love that about watercolor pencils. You can block in the main colors like I did in the mushroom, and then you can overlap more colors and blend everything quickly. It's also easy to layer and to add some details like I did there when I added little lines on the mushroom. After painting a loose layer, I really like to use the coloring hack to refine the painting and add texture. It was really useful to have pencils here to paint the grass, for instance, and that's where this medium shines. When you're able to leverage surprising effects with my hacks like the smooth effect, but also use their most known features. This coloring hack really is the best when you need control with whatever it is you're coloring, whether it is a mushroom, grass, or a branch. Cons would be that this hack will take time on large areas. That's why I don't use it for those now that I'm used to watercolor pencils. And like I said before, the outcome might vary with each brand. So in a full painting like this one, paint your background first on wet with a palette hack, and then add to it with a coloring hack. It will save you time and you will be able to use the watercolor pencils in their full potential. Recently, I discovered another hack to blend watercolor pencils, and I think it adds charm to a painting, but also a lot more than that. I found that I could scrape pigment off the lead with sanding paper and use that to enhance parts of a painting with my finger. I used it last time in this video on the girl's cheeks, and it added a lot of charm to the piece. Now in this painting, I wanted more vibrancy and shadows in the grass, but I wanted them fast, and I didn't want any streaks either. And I also needed a high concentration in pigments, since these were the last stages in the painting. That's why you can see I used the hack with my green pencil, even though it's a very light and subtle one. Right away, the whole grassy area just got enhanced, and that took me just a few seconds. And I also used the hack with my blue pencil, because the shadows didn't seem dark enough towards the bottom. And something I noticed with this is that if you wet the added pigment, you'll get a thick, almost opaque wash of paint. So that's something to keep in mind if you need to shortcut your way to very opaque washes of paint, but with a really smooth result. The pros here are this is a fast hack, and you can really use it for a rustic textured touch, or more vibrancy, more opacity. The main cons, however, is the lack of control. This is going to be better for large areas that your finger can cover, unless you want to use a blending stump or something like that. And keep in mind that when you activate that, if you do, because you don't have to, it's going to be thick and opaque. If you enjoyed this video, you will find many more on watercolor pencils in this playlist, or you can join me on Patreon to paint along as if we were hanging out. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and see you next time.